stranger arrived in town with a car too old for the woman driving it, and a name nobody had ever heard before. No one suspected that the quiet woman renting the last house on Maple Street was the same person running a corporation worth tens of billions of dollars. Every single day, she walked into a small woodworking shop owned by a widowed father, not to buy anything, not to invest in anything, but simply to watch him smile while he worked. Nobody could have guessed that long before her real name surfaced, she had already reshaped his entire life in ways he would only understand when it was almost too late. The town of Cedar Hollow woke up slowly every morning, the way small towns do, with the smell of coffee drifting from the diner on Main Street and the sound of the church bell marking 7 o'clock sharp. Ethan Carter was always awake before the bell rang. He unlocked the door to his woodworking shop at 6 in the morning, turned on the single overhead light that buzzed for a few seconds before settling, and ran his hand along the workbench, like he was greeting an old friend. The shop had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of sawdust soaked into the floorboards. Ethan moved through his mornings with a kind of quiet ritual, sweeping the corners that didn't need sweeping, sharpening tools that were already sharp, because the motion of his hands kept his mind from wandering somewhere he didn't want it to go. By 8, old Mr. Calloway would shuffle in with his cane, complaining about his kitchen chair wobbling again, and Ethan would fix it without charging him a single dollar, the same way he'd fixed it the 3 times before. By 10, Pastor Reynolds might stop by needing a hinge replaced on the church's side door, and Ethan would drop whatever he was doing to drive over and take care of it himself. When veterans came in needing shelving or repairs for their homes, Ethan waved off their money with a firm shake of his head, telling them their service had already paid enough. The whole town loved him for it. The kind of love that shows up in casseroles left on porches and waves from across the street. But love from a town doesn't fill the silence of an empty house at night. His house sat at the end of a gravel road, modest and weathered, and inside, nothing had changed in 3 years. Her sweater still hung on the hook by the back door. Her gardening gloves still sat on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, stiff with disuse. A pair of reading glasses she'd never gotten around to replacing still rested on the nightstand exactly where she'd left them the morning she went to the hospital for what everyone assumed would be a routine appointment. Ethan walked past these things every day without touching them, without moving them, as if rearranging a single object might somehow erase the last traces of a life that had ended too soon. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand in the doorway of the small room they had once planned to turn into a nursery, a plan abandoned long before Sarah's diagnosis for reasons that had nothing to do with illness, and he would simply look at the empty space without going inside. He was a man who gave everything to everyone around him and kept nothing for himself. And the town saw a hero where Ethan only saw a man trying to survive each day without falling apart. Some evenings he sat on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the sun drop behind the tree line, listening to the crickets start their slow chorus in the tall grass, and the loneliness would settle into his chest like a stone he'd long since stopped trying to lift. He had grown so used to the weight of it that he sometimes forgot what it felt like to walk without carrying something heavy. Then one Tuesday afternoon, a car nobody recognized rolled slowly down Main Street, its city plates catching the attention of every porch sitter and shopkeeper within view. It was an older sedan, practical and unremarkable. The kind of car that drew attention precisely because it didn't belong. Dust from some highway, still clinging to its fenders. Heads turned, curtains shifted. The woman at the hardware store set down the box of nails she was carrying just to watch it pass. In a town where everyone's vehicle was as familiar as their own, a stranger's car felt like an event. The kind of small disruption that would be discussed at the diner counter for days afterward, long before anyone understood just how much that single car was about to change. The car belonged to a woman who called herself Victoria Hale, and within 2 days she had rented the small house at the end of the street, the one that had sat empty for almost a year. She told the landlord, and later the woman at the post office, and eventually anyone who asked, that she was a writer looking for somewhere quiet to finish a book. Nobody questioned it. Writers came through small towns sometimes, looking for silence and cheap rent, and Victoria carried herself with the kind of plain, unhurried manner that made the story easy to believe. She wore simple clothes, drove herself everywhere, and never once mentioned a job title or a company name. What none of them could have known was that the woman renting that small house was Victoria Blake, chief executive officer of one of the largest technology and logistics conglomerates in the country, a woman whose decisions moved markets and whose face, when it did appear publicly, appeared in carefully managed photographs designed to reveal nothing personal at all. On her third day in town, Victoria walked into Ethan's shop for the first time. The bell above the door gave a soft chime, and Ethan looked up from the table he was sanding, wiping his hands on his apron before greeting her with the same warmth he gave every stranger who wandered in. She told him she wanted a reading chair, something simple, something that would fit in the corner of a small house with good light. Ethan walked her through the wood samples, explaining the grain of oak versus the warmth of cherry, and Victoria listened more closely than most customers did, asking questions that weren't really about furniture at all. She wanted to know how long he'd run the shop, whether he'd always lived in Cedar Hollow, what made him choose this life over a city like the one she'd just left behind. He answered simply, the way he answered everything, without performance or pretense. He told her his family had built furniture in this town for 3 generations, and that he couldn't imagine doing anything else with his hands. There was no calculation in his voice, no awareness that he was being observed, no sense that the woman across the counter from him was quietly comparing him to the dozens of men who had pursued her over the years, every one of them polished and ambitious, and utterly transparent in their hunger for what she represented. Victoria found herself staring a beat too long at the easy way. Ethan smiled at nothing in particular. The way he seemed entirely unbothered by the silence between sentences. She left that day with an order for a reading chair and a strange, unfamiliar warmth sitting somewhere beneath her ribs, one she didn't have a name for yet. That night, in the small rented house, Victoria opened a leather notebook she'd carried with her for years. Mostly empty. Reserved for thoughts she didn't trust to anyone else, not her assistants, not her lawyers, not even the handful of friends who had survived her rise to the top of the company. She uncapped a pen, hesitated for a long moment, with it hovering over the page, and wrote a single line about the man at the woodworking shop. About his hands, and about the unhurried way he moved through his own life, as though time owed him nothing, and he owed time nothing in return. She read the sentence back twice, then closed the notebook before she could examine why she'd written it at all, setting it on the nightstand, the way someone sets down something fragile they aren't quite ready to hold. Over the following 2 weeks, Victoria found reasons to return to the shop more often than any reading chair required. She asked Ethan to change the wood stain twice, claiming the color didn't match the light in her living room. She requested a small bookshelf to match the chair, then adjusted the dimensions after he'd already begun cutting the boards. She asked about the proper way to oil the wood so it wouldn't dry out, then asked again a week later, as though she'd forgotten the answer entirely. Ethan never once seemed annoyed by the repeated visits. If anything, he seemed to look forward to the sound of the bell above his door in the early afternoon, the hours when Victoria tended to appear. One afternoon, she asked if she could learn to do some of the finishing work herself, just to understand the process for a chapter she claimed to be writing. Ethan handed her a piece of sandpaper and showed her the motion, his hand briefly resting over hers to correct the angle, and something passed between them that neither acknowledged out loud. Over the following days, he taught her how to use the handsaw without splintering the grain, how to apply varnish in long, even strokes instead of small circles, how to tell when a piece of wood was ready to be sanded smooth. Victoria's hands, more accustomed to keyboards and pen signatures on million-dollar contracts, began collecting small calluses she found herself oddly proud of. She laughed in his shop one afternoon, a real, unguarded laugh, when a poorly clamped board sprang loose and sent a cloud of sawdust into the air between them. It was the kind of laugh she hadn't allowed herself in years. The kind that came without a calculation of who might be watching or what story the moment might generate. Ethan laughed with her, brushing sawdust from his sleeves, and for a moment, the only thing in the world was the warm afternoon light slanting through the shop windows, and the sound of 2 people who had both forgotten, briefly, how heavy their lives usually felt. Word reached the small town slowly, in the particular way gossip moves through a place where everyone knows everyone, that the writer renting the house on Maple Street seemed to be spending an awful lot of time at Ethan Carter's shop. Mrs. Higgins from the bakery mentioned it to her sister. The sister mentioned it to the mailman. Nobody thought much of it beyond a pleasant curiosity. The kind of harmless speculation small towns thrive on, certainly nobody imagining the truth behind the woman's quiet visits. Late one evening, while Victoria sat at the small kitchen table in her rented house, reviewing emails she'd been ignoring for days, her phone rang with a number she recognized immediately. It was her chief financial officer, his voice tight, with the particular urgency reserved for board matters. The board wanted a call, he said, regarding the upcoming merger vote and certain shareholders expressing concern about her extended absence from headquarters. Victoria stared at the phone for a long moment, then told him she'd call back later in the week, and ended the conversation before he could press further. She set the phone face down on the table and sat in the silence of the small house, feeling for the first time in years that the distance between her two lives was beginning to narrow in ways she wasn't ready to confront. A few days later, something shifted between them that neither had planned. Victoria had stayed later than usual, helping Ethan close up the shop, and as they stood near the back door waiting for the rain outside to ease, she found herself talking about things she rarely spoke of, not even to the handful of people she trusted at the company. She told him, without using names or details that might give her away, that she had spent most of her adult life surrounded by people who only wanted something from her. Board members who smiled while plotting against her. Suitors who proposed marriage within months of meeting her because the merger of fortunes appealed to them more than she ever could. She told him she had stopped trusting compliments a long time ago, because compliments had always come with strings attached. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and to her own surprise, tears followed, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in front of another person in longer than she could remember. Ethan didn't reach for his phone, didn't ask follow-up questions trying to identify who she meant or what world she came from. He simply listened, his presence steady and unhurried, and when she finished, he offered her a clean rag from his workbench instead of a tissue, which made her laugh through the tears in a way that loosened something tight in her chest. She did not tell him she was a chief executive officer. She did not tell him about the billions of dollars or the board meetings or the merger threatening to consume the next several months of her life. She only let him see the exhaustion underneath all of it. And that alone felt like more honesty than she'd offered anyone in years. In return, Ethan opened a door of his own that he rarely let anyone near. He told her about his wife, Sarah, about the diagnosis that had come without warning, about the 18 months that followed during which he'd watched the woman he loved most in the world disappear piece by piece while he stood by, helpless to stop any of it. He told her he'd once been offered a position at a furniture design firm in another city, a real opportunity to expand the family business into something larger, but that after Sarah passed, he couldn't imagine leaving the town where every street corner held a memory of her. He'd chosen to stay small, he said. Not because he lacked ambition, but because the life he had left was the only thing connecting him to the life he'd lost. Victoria listened to him the way he had listened to her, without trying to fix anything, without offering empty reassurances about time healing all wounds. She simply sat with him in the quiet of the closing shop. Two people who had each spent years performing strength for everyone around them, finally allowing themselves to be tired in front of someone else. When she left that night, neither of them said anything about what had passed between them, but both walked away changed, carrying something new and fragile they weren't ready to name. Meanwhile, back at corporate headquarters 200 miles away, Daniel Whitford sat in his office reviewing reports with a growing frustration that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings. Daniel had been pursuing Victoria for the better part of 2 years, not out of any genuine affection but because a merger between their two family-controlled companies would create an empire neither could build alone. He had proposed marriage 8 months earlier, in a manner so calculated it had embarrassed even his own assistant, framing the union as a strategic partnership before he'd ever mentioned love. Victoria had declined without much explanation, and Daniel, unaccustomed to rejection in any form, had simply waited for an opportunity to try again. When he learned through a colleague on the board that Victoria had quietly disappeared from the city for weeks at a time, citing vague reasons about needing space to think, Daniel's curiosity sharpened into something closer to obsession. He hired a private investigator under the guise of due diligence for the upcoming merger, instructing the man to discreetly track Victoria's movements and report back anything unusual. The investigator, a methodical man named Russo, began his work quietly, starting with credit card statements and gas station receipts, slowly piecing together a trail that led, much to his own surprise, toward a small town called Cedar Hollow that didn't appear on any list of business destinations Victoria Blake had ever frequented. Back in Cedar Hollow, life continued in its gentle rhythm. but strange and wonderful things had begun happening throughout the town. Things nobody could quite explain. The community hospital, which had been on the verge of closing its doors due to suddenly received an anonymous donation large enough to clear every outstanding loan and fund new equipment for the next 5 years. The elementary school, whose roof had been patched with tarps for 2 winters running, was completely renovated overnight by contractors who arrived, finished the work, and left without ever revealing who had hired them. A small vocational fund appeared, offering free trade school tuition to any young person in town who wanted to learn a skilled trade, with no fine print and no name attached beyond the simple phrase, "an anonymous benefactor." The town library received an upgrade nobody had requested. New computers, new shelving, a children's reading room built where a storage closet used to be, complete with a small mural of the town, painted across one wall by an artist who arrived, worked for 3 days safe, and disappeared without ever giving her name. Several small business owners who had quietly been drowning in debt found their loans mysteriously paid off in full, with bank representatives unable or unwilling to explain who had settled the accounts, only that the payments had arrived through channels too complicated to trace back to a single source. The diner where Ethan ate breakfast most mornings received a new roof after years of leaking during heavy storms, and the owner, a widow herself, wept openly at the counter the morning she found the repair already finished and paid for. The whole town buzzed with theories, guessing at lottery winners or distant relatives of long-dead founders, but nobody guessed the truth, that every single gift had come from the quiet woman renting the house on Maple Street, moving money through layers of shell accounts and trusted intermediaries so carefully that even her own legal team couldn't trace it back to her without specific instruction. Ethan noticed the changes the way everyone else did, with a kind of grateful disbelief, remarking to Victoria one afternoon, as they walked past the freshly painted library on their way back from lunch, that it felt like the whole town had been touched by some kind of miracle, as though Cedar Hollow had quietly been chosen by some unseen hand. Victoria only smiled and said that maybe good things happen to good places sometimes, that towns like this deserved a little luck after years of being overlooked by everyone who mattered. Ethan, having no reason to suspect otherwise, simply nodded and went back to sanding the table in front of him, his thoughts already drifting to the next order waiting on his bench. He had no idea that the miracle sat across the workbench from him nearly every single day, learning to use a chisel and laughing at her own clumsy mistakes, her billions of dollars worth less to her in that moment than the splinter she'd just pulled from her thumb. It was during this stretch of quiet happiness that Russo, the investigator hired by Daniel, finally arrived in Cedar Hollow himself, posing as a traveling salesman to ask careful questions at the diner and the gas station. Within a day, he had confirmed what his research had already suggested, that the woman calling herself Victoria Hale matched every physical description of Victoria Blake, right down to the small scar above her left eyebrow that no makeup ever fully concealed. He photographed her from a distance outside the woodworking shop, careful not to be seen, and sent his findings back to Daniel, along with a single text message confirming the location of Cedar Hollow. Daniel wasted no time. Within 48 hours, he had arranged a convoy that felt entirely out of place, rolling down the quiet streets of Cedar Hollow. 2 black sedans carrying his personal security team, a third car holding his legal counsel, and trailing behind them, against his explicit instructions but unable to resist the story, a small van from a regional news outlet that had picked up a tip about a corporate executive's mysterious disappearance. The convoy stopped directly in front of Ethan's woodworking shop on a bright Thursday afternoon, drawing every set of eyes on the street. Daniel stepped out first, dressed in a suit that cost more than most houses in town, his security detail flanking him like an entourage from a world Cedar Hollow had only ever seen on television. He walked straight into the shop, found Victoria standing near the workbench with sawdust still clinging to her sleeve, and announced, loud enough for half the street to hear through the open door, that the board needed Chief Executive Officer Blake back in the city immediately. The shop fell into a silence so complete that the dust motes seemed to stop moving in the afternoon light. Ethan stood frozen behind the counter, a half-finished chair leg still in his hand, staring at Victoria as the words settled over him like cold water. Outside, the small crowd that had gathered exchanged stunned glances. The writer from Maple Street suddenly transformed into someone none of them could reconcile with the quiet woman who'd been learning to sand wood beside their town's most beloved widower. Victoria turned to Ethan immediately, her face pale, already reaching for words that might explain everything. But Ethan had already set the chair leg down on the counter with a quiet, deliberate motion that somehow felt louder than any shout. He looked at her for a long moment, searching for something in her expression. And what he found instead was confirmation of everything Daniel had just announced. Without saying a word, he turned and walked out the back door of his own shop, leaving Victoria standing among the wood shavings and the silence and the wreckage of a secret she had never managed to tell him herself. She called his name once, her voice breaking on the single syllable, but Ethan didn't stop walking, and Daniel, sensing an opportunity in the chaos, stepped forward to usher Victoria toward the waiting car, speaking quickly about damage control and press statements and the merger vote that couldn't wait another day. Victoria allowed herself to be guided toward the sedan, too stunned by the look on Ethan's face to resist, and within the hour, the convoy was gone, leaving Cedar Hollow buzzing with a story that would dominate every porch conversation for weeks to come. That night, alone in her hotel suite in the city, Victoria sat staring out at a skyline that had never once made her feel as peaceful as a single afternoon in that small woodworking shop. She thought about leaving the company altogether, walking away from the empire her grandfather had built, simply disappearing back into Cedar Hollow and begging Ethan to understand. But morning brought board meetings and merger paperwork, and the particular gravity of responsibilities she couldn't simply abandon, and so days turned into a week, and the week turned into the beginning of a decision Victoria hadn't yet made peace with, whether to return to the town that had given her the only real happiness she'd known in years, or to disappear from Ethan's life entirely, and spare him whatever chaos her real world might bring, crashing down on his quiet one. Back in Cedar Hollow, the truth continued unraveling in pieces too large to ignore. A reporter who had tagged along with Daniel's convoy published a story identifying Victoria Hale as Victoria Blake. And within days, residents began connecting threads that had previously seemed like unrelated good fortune. Mrs. Higgins remembered the timing of the hospital's miraculous rescue and realized it had happened just weeks after Victoria arrived in town. The bank manager, after persistent questioning from curious neighbors, finally admitted under pressure that the anonymous payments clearing several small business loans had originated from a trust connected to Blake Industries. The school board discovered, buried in renovation paperwork, a donor name that had been redacted everywhere except a single overlooked invoice, where the letters spelled out Victoria Blake in plain, undeniable print. Piece by piece, the town reconstructed a portrait of the woman they thought they'd known as a quiet writer, and what emerged left even the most skeptical residents stunned into respectful silence. It wasn't only the hospital or the school or the small business loans. Someone eventually discovered that months earlier, before anyone in town had even met Victoria face to face, the parcel of land beneath Ethan's woodworking shop, land his family had only ever leased rather than owned, had quietly changed hands. The county records showed the property purchased by a holding company nobody recognized, just days before the original landowner had planned to sell it to a developer eager to turn Main Street into something far less personal. Without that purchase, Ethan would have lost his shop entirely within the year, evicted from the building his grandfather built with his own hands, and he would never have known the reason behind his sudden stay of fortune. The town began to understand, with a kind of dawning awe, that the woman who had silently saved their hospital and their school and their small businesses had also, before ever stepping foot in Ethan's shop, ensured he would still have a shop to walk into at all. It wasn't calculated affection or strategic kindness designed to win him over. The timeline made it clear she had protected his livelihood before she'd ever spoken a single word to him, before she'd ever learned his name or seen his face, as though some instinct had told her this man and this town deserved protecting long before she understood why. Neighbors who had known Ethan his entire life found themselves sitting on their porches in the evenings, turning the story over and over, trying to reconcile the image of a billionaire executive with the quiet, sawdust-covered woman who used to wave at them from across the street, and most concluded, after enough conversation, that perhaps the two images weren't so different after all. Ethan heard these stories secondhand, from neighbors stopping by his shop with apologetic faces, unsure whether to offer congratulations or condolences for a heartbreak that had played out in front of the entire town. He absorbed the information slowly, sitting alone in his shop each evening long after closing, running his fingers along the grain of unfinished wood while turning the truth over in his mind. He wasn't certain yet whether to feel grateful or betrayed, and the uncertainty kept him awake most nights, staring at the ceiling of a house that suddenly felt emptier than it had in years. It was during one of these long evenings that Ethan found the notebook. Victoria had left it behind in the chaos of that final afternoon, tucked beneath a stack of wood samples on a back shelf, where it had gone unnoticed for days. Ethan discovered it while reorganizing the shop, a simple leather-bound book with no title, no name on the cover, nothing to suggest it belonged to anyone in particular. He almost set it aside without opening it, respecting what felt like a private object, but curiosity, and perhaps a need for answers he hadn't allowed himself to ask aloud, won out. The pages inside told a story entirely different from the one the town had pieced together through bank records and renovation invoices. There was nothing about mergers or shareholders or strategic philanthropy designed to win goodwill. Instead, Ethan found page after page of small, careful observations, written in handwriting that grew looser and more honest as the entries progressed. The earliest pages described, with almost clinical detachment, a man at a woodworking shop who seemed unlike anyone she'd encountered in her entire adult life. Someone who gave freely without calculating what he might receive in return. As the entries continued, the detachment fell away entirely. She had written about the way he hummed quietly while working, off-key, and entirely unaware of it. She had written about the calluses forming on her own hands and how proud they made her feel, prouder than any business deal she'd ever closed. She had written, on a page dated only a few weeks earlier, that he was the first person in longer than she could remember who made her want to slow down, who made the idea of stillness feel like a gift instead of a wasted opportunity. Nowhere in the entire notebook did she mention his usefulness to her company, his potential as a business asset, or any strategic value at all. There was only a woman falling in love with a man for no reason, beyond the simple fact that being near him made her feel like a person again instead of a title. Ethan closed the notebook slowly, his hands trembling slightly, as the full weight of what he'd been wrong about settled over him. He had assumed, in his hurt and his shock, that everything between them had been some elaborate distraction for a bored billionaire, a temporary indulgence, before returning to a real life that had no place for a small-town widower. The notebook told a different story entirely, one of genuine, unguarded affection that had nothing to do with the empire she controlled, and everything to do with who she became when she was simply Victoria, sitting beside him in a shop full of sawdust and afternoon light. He sat with that knowledge for the rest of the night, and by morning, something in him had shifted from hurt into resolve. He couldn't undo the silence that had passed between them since that terrible Thursday afternoon, but he could refuse to let it become the final word. He packed a small bag, told Mr. Calloway to keep an eye on the shop, and drove the 200 miles to the city for the first time in longer than he could remember, carrying the notebook with him like proof of a truth he needed her to remember herself. He arrived at the headquarters of Blake Industries on the morning of an emergency board meeting that had been called specifically to address what Daniel and several shareholders were calling instability in leadership, a polite phrase for the fact that Victoria's recent disappearances had given certain board members the opening they'd been waiting for to push through a forced merger on terms heavily favorable to Daniel's family, company. Inside the boardroom, Daniel stood at the head of a long table, methodically laying out a case for why Victoria's judgment had become compromised, why a strategic marriage and merger between their two companies would stabilize the company's public image and reassure nervous investors. Victoria sat at the opposite end of the table, her expression carefully composed despite the exhaustion visible beneath her eyes, listening as Daniel suggested, with a calm that bordered on condescension, that she sign over a controlling percentage of her shares as a gesture of good faith toward the merger. A gesture he framed as necessary given recent questions about her commitment to the company. Several board members nodded along, their loyalty to Daniel's family fortune outweighing any loyalty to a woman who had quietly run the company with integrity for nearly a decade. Victoria's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a steadiness that surprised even herself. She told the room plainly that she would not be signing over her shares, would not be entertaining a marriage proposed as a corporate strategy, and would not allow her grandfather's company to be absorbed into someone else's legacy simply because a handful of board members preferred convenience over loyalty. Daniel's expression hardened, and he opened his mouth to respond, with the kind of practiced authority that had worked on every other room he'd ever stood in. But before he could speak, the door at the back of the boardroom opened. Ethan walked in wearing the same flannel shirt he wore in his shop, sawdust still faintly visible on the cuffs, utterly out of place among the tailored suits and polished conference table, and yet he crossed the room with the same unhurried confidence he carried everywhere else in his life. His boots were the same ones he wore every day at the workbench, scuffed and worn at the toe, and the contrast between him and the gleaming glass conference room was so complete that for a moment nobody seemed to know whether to laugh or call security. Every head in the room turned, confusion rippling through the assembled executives who had no idea who this stranger was or why security hadn't stopped him at the door, several of them already reaching for their phones to summon someone who would. Victoria's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met across the long table, and for a single, suspended second, the entire room of investors and lawyers and board members simply ceased to exist for her. He didn't address the board. He didn't acknowledge Daniel at all. Didn't engage with the merger talk, or the shares, or any of the language that had filled the room for the past hour. He looked only at Victoria and said simply that he hadn't come to discuss the company or the merger or anything happening in that boardroom, that he had come because he needed her to know he'd read the notebook, every page, and that he understood now what he should have understood that day in the shop before he walked away without listening. He told her he had come for her, plainly and without performance, the same way he'd always spoken to her, and that whatever happened with the company afterward was hers to decide, but he wasn't going to let pride or hurt feelings keep him from saying what he should have said weeks ago. The boardroom sat in stunned silence. Several of the older board members, women and men who had known Victoria since she first inherited the company from her grandfather, exchanged glances that carried more meaning than words could have. They had watched Victoria for years, watched her grow increasingly guarded, increasingly exhausted, increasingly hollow beneath the polished exterior she presented to shareholders. The woman standing in front of them now, color rising in her cheeks as she looked at a sawdust-covered widower from a town none of them had ever heard of, looked more alive than any of them had seen her in years. One of the eldest board members, a woman named Eleanor Vance, who had served on the board since Victoria's grandfather ran the company, rose slowly from her chair and remarked, to no one in particular, that whatever this man had done for Victoria, it had clearly done more good than every merger discussion they'd held in the past 2 years combined. Several others murmured agreement. And Daniel, sensing the room shifting beneath him in real time, attempted to redirect the conversation back toward the merger, his voice rising with barely concealed panic. But the momentum had already turned. Eleanor proposed a motion to table all merger discussions indefinitely, citing the obvious lack of board consensus and the inappropriate pressure Daniel had attempted to apply through a proposal that blurred personal and professional lines in ways the board should never have entertained in the first place. The motion passed with an overwhelming majority, and Daniel, his face flushed with humiliation, gathered his papers and left the boardroom without another word. His ambitions for an empire built on convenience rather than genuine partnership crumbling in real time in front of the very people he'd hoped to impress. Victoria walked around the long table toward Ethan, her composure finally breaking into something softer, something the boardroom had never witnessed from her before. She told him, quietly enough, that only he could hear, that she was sorry for never finding the right moment to tell him the truth herself, that she had been afraid the truth would change the way he looked at her, the way it had changed the way everyone else looked at her for as long as she could remember. Ethan took her hand, the same hand he'd once guided across sandpaper in his quiet shop, and told her that nothing about who she really was could ever change what he already knew to be true, that she was the first person in years to make him feel like living again instead of merely surviving. In the weeks that followed, life in Cedar Hollow began to settle into something new, a rhythm that honored both the quiet town it had always been and the larger world that had now, undeniably, become part of its story. Victoria did not disappear back into the city, nor did she abandon the company her grandfather had spent decades building. Instead, she began splitting her time deliberately, handling the responsibilities that genuinely required her presence in the city, while making Cedar Hollow the place she returned to whenever she could, no longer hiding behind the name Victoria Hale, but walking through town as exactly who she was. She announced, in a quiet conversation with the mayor rather than any press release, that she intended to invest directly and openly in the town that had given her something no amount of money had ever provided, a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was missing. The vocational fund that had once operated under the vague label of an anonymous benefactor now bore her name proudly, expanded to offer not just tuition assistance, but full apprenticeship placements with local craftsmen, starting, fittingly, with Ethan's woodworking shop. The shop itself received funding for an expansion, a second workspace built onto the back of the original building, large enough to host classes for anyone in town wanting to learn the trade that had sustained Ethan's family for 3 generations. Together, Victoria and Ethan opened what they decided to call Maker's House, a community workshop where anyone, young or old, could come learn woodworking, leatherwork, and other trades from teachers who genuinely loved what they did. The grand opening drew nearly the entire town, folding chairs set up in rows across the gravel lot, lemonade in mismatched pitchers, and Mr. Calloway, of all people, cutting the ribbon with a pair of shears Ethan had sharpened for him that very morning. It became, almost immediately, the heartbeat of a town that had always valued craftsmanship over flash. And watching Victoria teach a group of teenagers how to properly sand a tabletop, her sleeves rolled up and sawdust dusting her forearms, no one watching would have guessed she had once stood in boardrooms commanding the attention of investors managing billions of dollars. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she preferred the sound of sandpaper against pine to the sound of applause in any conference hall she'd ever stood in. Ethan, for his part, never changed the fundamental rhythm of his life. He still opened the shop at 6 every morning, still fixed Mr. Calloway's chair whenever it wobbled, still refused payment from veterans who tried to insist. What changed was the quiet absence that used to fill the house at the end of the gravel road. Victoria's presence settled into his life gradually, never overwhelming the simplicity he cherished, learning instead to love the slowness of his days, rather than trying to fill them with anything more complicated than they needed to be. On a particular afternoon in early autumn, the kind where the light turns gold and the air carries the first real chill of the coming season, Victoria and Ethan sat together on the porch of his house, the same porch where he used to sit alone with his sweet tea and his quiet grief, watching the same tree line, the same fading light, but no longer carrying the weight he once carried into every quiet evening. The sweater that had hung by the back door for 3 years had finally been moved, folded gently, and placed in a box Ethan kept in the closet. Not forgotten, but no longer a wound left open for the world to see. He had done it himself, one Sunday morning, without Victoria asking him to, and afterward he had sat on the porch step for nearly an hour before going back inside, letting himself feel whatever needed to be felt before closing that particular door for good. Beside it now sat small traces of a new life, slowly weaving itself into the old one, a second coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet, a pair of boots by the front door that weren't his, a stack of mail addressed to Victoria Blake that the postman delivered without comment, as though the town had simply decided, without ever discussing it, that she belonged here now, as much as anyone born within its limits. Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the sun drop slowly behind the tree line the way it always had, the same crickets beginning their evening chorus in the tall grass, and told him, with a small laugh in her voice, that she had originally come to this town hoping to hide from the entire world for just a little while, expecting nothing more than a quiet place to disappear for a few weeks before returning to a life that demanded every part of her. Ethan wrapped his fingers around hers, feeling the small calluses that hadn't been there when they first met, calluses earned honestly through hours, spent learning a craft that had nothing to do with the empire she controlled, and everything to do with the woman she'd quietly become while no one was watching. He told her, in the same plain and unhurried voice he used for everything that truly mattered to him, that somewhere along the way, without either of them quite realizing it was happening, she had stopped being someone hiding from the world, and had instead become the entire world he'd thought he'd lost the ability to want. The town of Cedar Hollow went on much as it always had. The church bell ringing at 7. The diner filling with the smell of coffee. The woodworking shop opening its doors at 6 sharp every morning. But within that familiar rhythm now lived something new, a quiet proof that the truest miracles rarely announce themselves with fanfare, that sometimes they arrive disguised as a stranger with an old car and a borrowed name, patiently waiting in a small shop full of sawdust and afternoon light for someone to teach them, finally, how to slow down and simply live.